All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating historical encounter. September 26, 1960. A night that literally changed how we choose our leaders. You know, before this specific night, politics belonged entirely to the spoken word. It was the domain of the radio, the morning newspaper, the old wooden podium. But today, we're going to explore the exact moment those old rules were just tossed out the window, and politics dramatically crashed into the visual age.
So let's dive into this. How exactly did a single live broadcast act as a massive psychological experiment, one that split the American electorate right down the middle? It's a wild question, really. The folks sitting comfortably in their living rooms had absolutely no idea that they were participating in an event so jarring it would divide them not by their deep political ideologies, but entirely by how they consumed the media. We're looking at the ultimate real-time test of image versus substance. And to really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this experiment, you've got to know the number. 70 million. 70 million Americans tuned in that night to watch the first ever live televised presidential debate from CBS studios in Chicago. I mean, that wasn't just a political event. It was a massive cultural milestone, a shared national experience on a scale we'd rarely seen before. But to truly grasp what happened under those bright studio lights, we actually have to look at what went down before the cameras even started rolling. Part 1. The variables. The prep ruse. Because you see, this debate was essentially won and lost backstage before a single microphone was even turned on. The physical contrast between these two men, absolutely staggering. JFK spent the days leading up to the debate just soaking up the California sun. He showed up to the studio with this deep tan, wearing a dark, beautifully tailored suit that gave this sharp, high contrast against the studio's light gray backdrop. When they offered him makeup, he just calmly declined. He simply didn't need it. Now, Richard Nixon, completely different story. He was coming off a brutal knee injury. He was exhausted, recently hospitalized, like 20 pounds underweight, and wearing a light gray suit that pretty much blended right into the background. He looked almost like a ghost. And for makeup, he relied on a cheap drugstore product called Lazy Shave just to hide his 5 o'clock shadow. These were the two very different men who walked out onto that stage. Part 2. The execution. The great illusion. Now remember, television as a medium for presidential debates was completely untested. Nobody really knew how those intense, baking studio lights would affect the candidates over a long live broadcast. But if we look purely at the substance of what was being said, Nixon actually performed incredibly well. Honestly, he spoke brilliantly. His arguments were highly structured, aggressive, deeply knowledgeable. He focused heavily on complex economics and nuanced foreign policy, and he matched his opponent's statistic for statistic, policy for policy. On paper, his arguments were rock solid. But here's the kicker. The television audience didn't care about the statistics. What they saw was a rigid, uncomfortable man looking off camera and literally wiping streams of sweat from his face. Meanwhile, JFK looked calmly and directly into the camera lens with that handsome smile. Under those hot studio lights, Nixon's lazy shave makeup was quite literally melting. His face looked hollow, and his eyes, well, rather than looking at the viewers at home, they kept darting nervously toward the journalists in the room. Kennedy was speaking straight to the voters. So Kennedy began to shine, while Nixon began to physically melt. It turned into this fierce battle between what people were hearing and what people were seeing. Part 3. The climax, the polling paradox. When pollsters hit the streets the morning after the debate, the data they got back was just mind-blowing. This right here is the massive plot twist of the entire event. The millions of Americans who only listened to the debate on the radio, they overwhelmingly thought Richard Nixon won. To them, he sounded mature, prepared, commanding. But among the television viewers, the result was the exact opposite. They thought JFK won in a landslide because he looked like a natural leader, whereas Nixon just looked like a man with something to hide. It's crazy, a single event experienced in two completely opposite ways, depending entirely on the technology used to consume it. This encounter proved that the medium had completely altered the message. We had officially entered the visual age. This meant politics abruptly shifted from the spoken word to an era of optics and image. An era where how you look saying something matters vastly more than what you are actually saying. The brilliant words, the deep statistics, the perfectly structured arguments, they were all instantly overshadowed by a confident smile, good posture, and a high-contrast dark suit. Part 4. The aftermath, the modern era of optics. The damage to old-school substance-first politics was done forever. The rules of the game were totally rewritten. In fact, the trauma of this visual disaster was so severe that Nixon flat-out refused to debate on television during his 1968 campaign.
And it actually took a full 16 years before presidential candidates would agree to step in front of the cameras together again. Just let that number sink in for a second. 16 years. That is how terrified politicians became of the television camera's power to destroy a campaign based purely on optics. That September 1960 encounter didn't just decide the election that brought JFK to the White House, it birthed our entire modern world of meticulous media training, super expensive image consulting, and carefully curated sound bites. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to ponder today. Did we ever actually learn to listen to the substance again, or are we just forever trapped in the visual age? Because since that night, it kind of seems like America's stopped listening to its leaders and started judging a book by its cover. So next time you sit down to watch a debate or a political speech, ask yourself, are you actually being swayed by a structured argument, or are you just being sold a really good dark suit and a confident smile? Thanks so much for exploring this with me today. I really hope this explainer gave you a whole new lens on how we view our world.